pleased and indeed honored to welcome Sir Venkatraman Ramakrishnan, known as Venki to his friends. He is our chief guest this evening. He is someone that the whole world can look up to. I am grateful that he accepted my invitation to be here with us on this joyous occasion. He was a member of the jury for the Infosys Prize in Life Sciences in 2012. Dr. Ramakrishnan has had an exciting journey in finding his passion, that is, structural biology. He went from India to the US, then to the UK, and from physics to biology. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in physics in 1971 from Maharaja Sayajirao University in Baroda. He obtained his PhD in physics in 1976 from Ohio University, Athens, Ohio. He then switched gears, spent 2 years studying biology as a graduate student at the University of California, San Diego, Pradeep's university, while making a transition from theoretical physics to biology, his true love. Very interestingly, very quickly, once he found his true love, true passion, Dr. Ramakrishnan won the Nobel Prize in chemistry in 2009, along with Thomas A. Steets and Ada Yonath for the studies of the structure and function of the ribosome. He received a Padma Vibhushan from the Government of India in 2010 and a knighthood from the Government of the United Kingdom in 2012 for his stellar services to molecular biology. Dr. Ramakrishnan became the president of the Royal Society in 2015. He was elected a member of the European Molecular Biology Organization, EMBO, in 2002. He was elected a member of the US National Academy of Sciences in 2004. He is a foreign fellow of the Indian National Science Academy. He is the recipient of Louis Jontet Prize for Medicine and Datta Lectureship and the Medal of the Federation of European Biological Sciences and Societies. In 2008, he won the Heatley Medal of the British Biochemical Society. He is a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. We have 2 Trinity College fellows here, Amartya and of course Dr. Ramakrishnan. He is the recipient of Sir Hans Krebs Medal given by the Federation of European Biochemical Societies. Folks, it is indeed a great pleasure and a privilege and of course an honor to have him here. I now request Dr. Ramakrishnan to address us this evening.
Thank you very much. Actually, the honor is entirely mine, especially considering the distinguished chairs of the jury, any one of whom could have probably given a more thoughtful speech than I'm about to give you now. So first of all, I'd like to begin by congratulating the winners on their wonderful achievements and in such diverse areas that just show you the remarkable breadth of science. Now, prizes are not the goal of scientists, or at least they shouldn't be. Sometimes human emotions get in the way. But they're milestones in a long journey. And if you were to ask any of these prize winners how they decided to embark on their journey, which is unfinished, I should add, none of them would say, oh, well, I thought there'd be a big prize at the end of it. It was much more that they found a question that they were fascinated by, or they saw an important problem, and they went on to work on that. But having said that, prizes do serve a useful purpose, which is to give science publicity and also to produce good role models for young people, including young scientists. I mean, all sorts of people get publicity. We give sports people a lot of publicity. We give actors lots of publicity. But scientists usually are quietly working away and, away from the glare of publicity. And it's nice, once in a while to recognize them for what they do, because what they do actually has a much bigger impact on us than virtually any other profession. And the Indian science community should therefore be grateful for a major award for scientists, especially those who are working in India. Now, why is science important, and why should we pay attention to it? Now, in the broadest sense, science is really a term for knowledge. It comes from the Latin word scientia. And you can think of it as the acquisition of knowledge, and you can think of it as broadly divided into three kinds of science. You can have basic research, which is simply the acquisition of new knowledge about the natural world. You can have applied research, which is can be basic, but is aimed at specific objectives and outcome. So, for example, cancer biology, it falls in that sort of intermediate area. And you can have translational research, which is a bridge between basic and applied research, or goal-oriented basic research. And technology is the skilled production of goods and services, which relies on knowledge about the world in order to apply it. But it's not a linear relationship. Many people say that basic science leads to applied science, which leads to technology, as if it was a sort of one-way traffic. But it's a very complex, intertwined web. I mean, a simple example is quantum theory, which was completely, basic fundamental science, eventually led to transistors and lasers. And those in turn led to computers and new devices, which in turn are driving new fundamental discoveries. So, this sometimes comes full circle, sometimes they go hand in hand. There's no particular paradigm except to say that it's a complicated, interlinked web. Now, one thing I should say about basic science is that it can, first of all, it can lead to entirely new technologies that you couldn't even imagine, couldn't even have imagined. And sometimes this happens decades or centuries later. Now, a favorite example I like to give is Michael Faraday, who was investigating the laws of electromagnetic induction. And apparently, I forget whether it was the Prime Minister or Queen Victoria, but some leading light visited him and said, well, what good is it? Yes, I now remember. I think it was Queen Victoria. Anyway, he said, well, one day, madam, you may tax it. And of course, if you were to estimate the tax on electricity today, and all of electricity is really based, the way we generate electricity is based on Faraday's laws of induction, it's probably in the trillions of dollars, okay? So it's quite a lot of tax there. Anyway, but it took a long time between Faraday's laws of induction to electricity being, a general feature of light. I mean, just take a look at this room and just think about how you're actually listening to me through the speaker system. The same thing between Newton's laws and satellites. Newton's laws of motion govern, for example, the satellite and the rockets that were launched to the moon or Mars depend very much on Newton's laws of motion. But to go from Newton's laws to satellites took about 300 years. Now, I'll give you an even stranger example. When Einstein discovered the laws of general relativity and special relativity, it didn't look like these small, changes in time as a result of relative motion would have any practical application. But I can assure you that without relativity, without special and general relativistic corrections, none of your GPSs would work. So today, relativity is present in every smartphone that you use to figure out where you're going, okay? And that took about 100 years. It can also happen in entirely unexpected ways, even faster. For example, the internet was, really designed to have a computer system that was, proof to destruction of one computer. You could have, network computers. It was funded by the Defense Department through DARPA. That led to the internet. But even after the internet, high-energy physicists wanted to figure out easy ways to exchange information that could be both visual and quantitative. And that led to the World Wide Web. And no one imagined that you would use that to, do your shopping or, order services and order food. You can order food through the internet, So no one imagined that that would come out of high-energy physics and these sorts of applications. So science has not only transformed our world, but it's also brought enormous benefits to health. Life expectancy, for example, has doubled in just the last century, and a lot of that, not all of it, a lot of it is due to, common sense public health measures, but a lot of it is due to scientific and medical advances that depended on science. Even if science, ignoring all the benefits that science brings, it's a great triumph of human understanding. Imagine, if we were to go back 200 or 300 years and we could talk to the smartest people of that time and tell them that, look, we understand the molecular basis of inheritance, something that had puzzled people for centuries. How do we inherit traits? Why does a kid look like, his or her parents? I mean, that's something, why do fish, when they mate, only produce fish? Why don't they produce, frogs or something else? These are, fundamental mysteries. And, if we were to go back and say, we actually understand in molecular terms how this information is transmitted from one generation to the next, how a single cell can, grow into an organism, things like that. This is a triumph of human understanding. It's as much a part of our culture as art and music and any of these other things. And finally, virtually every product you think of has basic science that underpins it. I pointed out how the smartphone or electricity is based on basic science, but you can just imagine almost any gadget or tool that you use, and you'll find that there's some basic science that's at some point without which that wouldn't have been possible. And many top companies today, if you look at top 10 companies by capitalization, many of them didn't even exist 50 years ago, but more importantly, many of their industries that they represent didn't exist 50 years ago. And that shows you how transformative science and technology have been. Now, how do we achieve this sort of science and technology in a society? Now, I'm going to be accused here of practicing some economic history without a license. You've heard that I'm a physicist turned biologist, so I'm no better at it than any one of you, but I'll just give you my thoughts, okay? One of them is that natural resources don't seem to be as important as knowledge or technology. For example, Africa as a continent is extremely rich in natural resources. Russia is extremely rich in natural resources. But countries like Switzerland and Singapore are much more advanced economically, and certainly Switzerland is much more advanced in terms of science as well as technology. And so I would argue that the wealth of a country depends on knowledge and innovation. Now, many of us like to think that Britain got rich as a result of colonization, and I would argue this isn't true. It may be true, the converse may be true, that colonies may have been hurt by colonization. That you could probably make a good case for, and Amartya is probably better place to say that. But the reason I say that Britain's wealth didn't come from colonization, but rather from innovation, is you can look at all of Europe. Britain was one of the most innovative countries in Europe. And if you look at other innovative countries in Europe, some of the richest countries in Europe in the 19th and early 20th century were Sweden, Switzerland, and Germany, which had either no colonies or very few colonies. Okay? On the other hand, countries like Spain and Portugal, which were not knowledge-based economies, which were not technologically advanced, but which had huge colonies. In fact, on a per capita basis, Portugal probably had the biggest colonization, tiny country with very large colonies. They were really not very well off. They were among the poorest countries in Europe. And it shows you that really what makes countries wealthy is not resources, not colonization, but rather knowledge and innovation. Now, poorer countries can initially spur economic growth by exploiting discoveries made elsewhere. And I can give you two examples. For example, in the US, Edison's light bulb, we think of it as Edison's, but it was really invented by a fellow named Swan in the UK. And then Edison really was a genius at marketing and really took it over. And in fact, I believe he bought Swan's company, if I'm not mistaken. And a more recent example is wind turbines. A Danish company set up manufacturing in China, but then this resulted in know-how being transferred to the Chinese themselves, and Chinese companies then set up in competition and now dominate the wind turbine market. And this is a sort of general phenomenon, and that is that economic growth often precedes scientific growth. For example, in 1908, the US became the world's largest economy, but it wasn't a major scientific power until the 1940s or 1950s. Most of the basic fundamental discoveries in science were still being done in Europe. Similarly, Japan had become a first-rate economy by the 1960s, but you wouldn't think of it as a world, there were always exceptions, and I'll come to that in a minute, but you wouldn't think of it as generally a world-leading scientific power until much later. But now, for the last 2 decades or so, Japan is really a world-leading scientific power that regularly wins Nobel Prizes and so on. And today you can think that perhaps Singapore, which is now leading, very well off economically, is on its way to becoming a leading scientific power. And possibly that is going to happen to China as well, which is heavily investing in science. But in order to make that transformation from an economic power to a leading scientific power, you do need to have a certain level of high quality science. So even by 1908, the US already had world-class scientists. It may not have been the leading scientific country, but it had world-class scientists. For example, the Millikan oil drop experiment from Caltech, one of the Trustee's institutions, which showed that the charge on the electron was quantized, was in the early 1900s. A very important experiment done in the late 19th century was the Michelson-Morley experiment, which showed that light travels, there's no ether, and light travels at the same, the velocity of light is the same regardless of the direction relative to the Earth's motion. And T.H. Morgan did brilliant work on the connection between chromosomes and genes. He was a geneticist at Columbia and then later Caltech. So you need a certain high level of basic science in order to make that transition to a knowledge-based economy. And you also need basic science even to exploit new technologies. For example, if you wanted to exploit biotechnology, but you didn't have people who understood molecular biology, you won't be able to exploit biotechnology even if it was invented somewhere else. Okay, so there is a need for broad-based support for science. And this leads to a question of why a country should invest in science. Why not simply use discoveries somewhere else and then just simply apply them here? Well, first of all, I pointed out you need to have basic science within the country, even to have enough understanding of new technologies in order to be able to apply them. And that scientific understanding is the basis of applied fields like engineering or medicine. So without that, you won't be able to exploit new technology. There's also a question of the first mover effect. For example, if a new discovery, fundamental discovery is made, those people who are interested in applying it, who are around, will have heard of that discovery before anybody else has. So they'll have what's called the first mover advantage. And this is one reason why, places like the Bay Area in the US or Boston or the Cambridge cluster in the UK are such engines for new technology, because there's a lot of basic science around them, so they come to know about these discoveries first. Another thing that is useful is the agglomeration effect. So once you have a large sort of diverse group of industries springing up around an area, then all sorts of complementary expertise and skills are available locally. So if you're going to start up a company, there's lots of know-how around, there's complementary expertise around, there are other companies you can talk to and so on. And that's happening, for example, here in Bangalore, and it's the same reason why you have these clusters in the West. So this leads to a question of how countries can sort of become leading innovative countries. And the US and Chinese history suggests that exploiting discoveries made elsewhere is a good starting point, but even that will require a good level of basic science, and that means a strong indigenous research establishment. Now, when it comes to India, you could concentrate. India has a number of options. You could try to compete with the best in the world, or you could work on problems that then become the most interesting in the world. For example, you could focus on problems that are particularly important to India, or you could work on areas. I mean, we saw one of the winners of the Infosys Prize worked on rotavirus, particularly important problem here, but led to some really superb science, okay? So working on Indian problems doesn't mean that you have to sacrifice quality. In fact, you may then be the innovator that everybody else becomes interested in. And you can also work on areas where India has a unique advantage. Now, one of the advantages of India is that, if you have diseases like TB or rotavirus, which are prevalent in India. So this is you can think of that as an opportunity to do excellent work. And India has a large biodiversity. It has large human diversity. In fact, the human genomic diversity in India is greater than many parts of the world. And so it's a great opportunity to do interesting work. India also trains a lot of people in physics, chemistry, and engineering and mathematics, particularly strong. And these people could be encouraged to go into other disciplines like biology and epidemiology and medicine and so on. Now, I have to say, I heard recently that the government has announced an ambition to be a top science country, one of the top 3 countries by 2030. Now, this is a rather ambitious goal, considering where Indian science is today. There are lots of very good scientists in India, but the overall level of science in India for a country its size is certainly not where it should be, and it's certainly not anywhere near the top 3. And so how could, is this even achievable? Well, I'd say it's very difficult, but if you want to do it, it'll require a sustained and substantial commitment to science. It cannot be sort of, okay, I'll try it out for a few years, and if it doesn't work, I'll move on to something else. You have to realize it's a long-term goal. Science takes decades before you can have an impact. And it also has to be coupled with good practices in nurturing and supporting good science. India currently underinvests in science by quite a lot, and I'm talking now about the government of India, but what's even worse than government underinvestment in science is the abysmal investment in science, in R&D, of the private sector in India. Now, most countries in the West, the ratio is about 2 to 1. For every unit that the government invests in science, the private sector invests about twice that, okay? For example, in the UK, the government invests about 0.6 to 0.7% of GDP, and the private sector like GlaxoSmithKline or Rolls-Royce and other companies invest about twice that. And so Indian companies, Indian industries now have to ask, why are they not investing more in R&D? If they want to be in India to be an innovative country, they've got to do more of that. It also needs good governance. Now, one of the jury chairs, Inder Verma, and I spent the last 3 days reviewing what's an organization called the India Alliance, which funds biomedical sciences in India and is jointly funded by the Wellcome Trust in the UK and the Department of Biotechnology of the Government of India. Although it's not a government organization, it's a completely autonomous organization. And this is an example of very good governance and administration of science in India. For example, when we asked fellows, what do you like about the India Alliance? Of course, they liked the fact that they were generously funded, but there were other things that they liked even more. For example, they said, if you apply for an India Alliance fellowship and the fellowship is awarded, you can be sure that the money shows up in 2 months, okay? And that's not true in other agencies. Now, why shouldn't it be true? There's no reason why it shouldn't be true. The other thing the India Alliance does is to make the money flexible. Suddenly you need more supplies and you can use money that was earmarked for equipment to buy more supplies. You have to be able to decide on the fly how your science is going. You have to be flexible. For example, if you haven't spent all your money because you didn't hire somebody straight away, or the research went a little slower, you might be able to spend it more next year when you need it more. So you should be able to carry over. So these sorts of freedoms are what scientists need. And also freedom from politicization. Politics has no real role in science. Now, governments absolutely have the right to set priorities. It's the job of elected politicians to set priorities for the country. Nobody elected scientists, so they don't get the right to set overall priorities for the country. But having set overall goals, scientists should be left alone to carry out, to implement those policies. And so they should be free from intrusion and politicization. Now, finally, in science, evidence is what matters, not authority. And that's both its beauty and its strength. It means, not caring who's saying something, but rather looking at the evidence. And so you shouldn't care whether someone who's a biophysicist dabbling in economic history is a Nobel laureate, but rather you should look at the evidence behind what the person is saying. And what this means is you should take everything I said with a grain of salt and look at the evidence behind it. And the reason that's important is we're living in a world in which all sorts of claims are propagated, often with no basis in fact. These things now spread by social media, and often, people take these as some sort of, dogma. And in fact, the Oxford English Dictionary announced that post-truth was the word of the year for 2016. And this followed, the elections and the Brexit referendum in the UK and the election of the Honorable President-elect Trump in the US. And so in a world like that, where, we live in a complex society, science becomes more important than ever. So I want to conclude by thanking the foundation for supporting, not just for this prize, but for supporting so many aspects of science, especially of science education and other areas of science. And thank you for listening.